The history of mankind is filled with war. Out of 3,400 years, only 268 have been without conflict. That's barely a pause in a timeline of battles. Empires have risen and fallen, borders have shifted, yet a handful of countries have stood firm, nearly impossible to conquer. What gives them this edge? In this video, we're counting down 10 countries that seem untouchable, places even the world's greatest armies would hesitate to challenge. But what really makes them so unconquerable? And if they were truly pushed to the limit, could they hold their ground? Stick around as we explore the secrets behind the world's top 10 toughest places to conquer. But before we get started with our list, let's go over some of the most common reasons why a country might be considered unconquerable. The first, and probably one of the most significant factors that influence how likely a country can be conquered, is its geography. There are a few different types of landscapes that favor being on the defensive or mounting successful counteroffensives or counterattacks. A country that is particularly hilly or mountainous is significantly more difficult to traverse. Typically, vehicles, or before the internal combustion engine was invented, caravans of animals, needed relatively flat ground, and usually a lot of it, to be able to go from point A to B in a reasonable time. Mountainous terrain usually creates natural choke points in valleys where the invading army has to significantly alter its operations and movement. These choke points become vital places for the defending nation to put a bulk of its forces. They can usually set up their long-range weaponry to take advantage of the high ground surrounding the choke point. However, even flat terrain can be perilous for the invading armies. Marshy terrain drastically reduces the speed at which troops can move. Some vehicles pretty much stop working entirely when they need to go through terrain that won't support their weight and get stuck. Rivers and large straits are also some of the most notorious places to overcome for an invading nation. A large river, whether navigable or not, can require significant resources to cross over. Historically, large rivers such as the Danube would create either a natural border between countries or bisect them. The first was due to the river being difficult to cross in those places. The second was due to the strategic importance of having a large river within the border. If an enemy advanced into the country, they would only be able to occupy half of the territory. The bridges connecting the land on either side of the river would practically be lifelines that the defending nation would have full control over. The enemy couldn't risk going over the bridge. If they did, the defenders could destroy the bridge, preventing their advance or retreat and inflicting heavy casualties on the enemy. Finally, there's the matter of the pervasive climate in the country. Nations that have swathes of land in barren tundra or desert are particularly difficult to invade. The simple reasoning for that is that the enemy needs to provide enormous amounts of supplies for a traveling army, whereas the defense has the option of holding up in major population centers, where there's sufficient infrastructure to withstand a prolonged siege. Worse yet, if the enemy attacks at an inopportune time and is forced to retreat, the extreme cold or heat is potentially more deadly than the defending army. Most of the countries on our list will usually have a combination of these factors, so keep an eye on them throughout the video. The second major factor that helps countries resist invasion is their own military presence. Naturally, a country with a large military will have significantly better chances of being able to go toe-to-toe with an enemy. The military presence can be further broken down in several ways. First, there is the active military, in particular its size, since active military are the first ones deployed in cases of war. Next, the number of reserve personnel can also be a significant factor. Reserve personnel come from two backgrounds: people who are not part of the standing army and are not kept on bases, but who receive periodic military training and drills, serve in the military part-time, and keep a traditional job. The second are people who underwent compulsory or voluntary military training and have since left the country's armed forces but are still young enough to serve in that nation's army. Therefore, countries with more strict requirements on mandatory military service typically have a far bigger pool of reservists they can call upon to defend their borders. The third significant factor that influences how likely a country can be conquered is geopolitics, or more precisely, alliances and bordering nations. Large international alliances such as NATO create a significant deterrence against a member country being invaded. And even if a country isn't part of an alliance, all of its members are in effect allies and are typically not going to go to war against one another. This allows nations to focus their defensive fortifications and strategies on the section of their border that abuts non-alliance members, since its borders with allied countries are safe. As a result, a country can improve strategic operations and reduce supply costs. Apart from these three major factors, there are tons of others that can be relevant to deterring war on a per-country basis. But now let's dig into the list to see how they come into play. The first country on our list is one that you might not associate with being difficult to conquer, partially because it's a relatively small country that doesn't come into the spotlight often. The country is Bhutan. Bhutan is located entirely in the Himalayas, the world's tallest mountain chain. As a landlocked country that borders two superpowers in their own right, India and China, Bhutan is relatively insignificant on the global scale. The country has one of the lowest rates of urbanization, with only 44% of its 793,000 citizens living inside cities. There are a few main reasons we put Bhutan on the list, the first being the aforementioned mountainous terrain. With an average elevation of over 10,000 feet, Bhutan's landscape can be perilous. In fact, during the 17th century, when the British Empire tried to conquer the small nation, it never managed to occupy the entire country. This led to the Kingdom of Bhutan waging a prolonged campaign against the British East India Company, with skirmishes that would continue for over 100 years without a satisfactory conclusion for either side of the conflict. The fact that Great Britain, the world's largest military empire at the time, wasn't able to conquer such a small nation, it's roughly only 50% larger than Maryland, speaks to the importance of terrain being used to its utmost advantage. In modern times, however, Bhutan is less unable to be conquered and more irrelevant to be conquered. Sandwiched between China and India, Bhutan maintains a practically negligible standing army of around 8,000 troops and has no air force to speak of. Furthermore, the country's army is fully trained and supported by India, its southern neighbor, which is also providing air force support through one of its air force command centers. This means that India has taken it upon itself to defend Bhutan from nations that would attack it via the air. China and India are the only two countries that would be able to mount a land-based offensive on the nation today, but there are practically no reasons to do so. Bhutan is not a part of any geopolitical bloc, nor has it made any meaningful diplomatic relations with countries other than China and India. Additionally, the country is practically barren of natural resources. Its economy mostly consists of agriculture and animal husbandry, tourism, and selling electricity created by hydroelectric power. This means that an invading army would practically need to destroy the same resources they would try to obtain. Bhutan is just one of the many countries that benefit from being too little and too isolated to be worth invading, but it's one that takes it to the extreme. The next country on the list is perhaps the exact opposite: Iran. Iran is the 17th largest country in the world by land area. This makes it an absolutely massive endeavor to conquer fully. This is compounded by Iran's extreme terrain. The eastern part of Iran is practically entirely made of highlands and mountain chains. The western part of the country is similarly hilly. This creates natural separations between the country's coastal areas, the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman to the south, the Caspian Sea to the north, and the low-lying center. The country's capital, Tehran, is practically next to the nation's highest peak, Mount Davamand, which stands at close to 19,000 feet above sea level. Iran's unfavorable geography is accentuated by the fact that it's relatively close to nations that are its geopolitical opponents, including Saudi Arabia, Israel, and Turkey. Additionally, the US is outright hostile to Iran due to their opposing systems after the 1979 Iranian Revolution. Yet despite these geopolitical relations, the country hasn't been in open conflict against other nations since World War II, indicating the sheer difficulty of mounting an assault on the inhospitable terrain. The country's natural defenses are reinforced with man-made ones, with networks of tunnels and military compounds stretching through Iran's mountain ranges. This allows the country to rapidly deploy defensive measures throughout the heavily defensive choke points, stopping the progress of enemy invasions nearly instantaneously. The government also claims that it's built a missile depot 500 meters underground throughout these tunnels, adding to the nation's defense systems. In theory, an enemy would have to remove each fortification piece by piece, making it a grueling process. Iran also maintains a healthy military size, with an estimated active personnel of over 500,000 troops. Additionally, the country has access to Soviet-era tanks, with its main battle tanks being modified T-72s that are upgraded with gun stabilizers, night vision, rangefinders, and electronic warfare components. The nation also has a robust military and kamikaze drone program, with some of the most modern drones currently being used around the world hailing from the country. Finally, there are rumors that Iran has started its own nuclear weapons programs, which would allow it to join a small cohort of 9 nations that own them. Economically, Iran was under long-term sanctions by the US for roughly 35 years, most of which also prohibited the country from importing weapon systems. While some of the sanctions have since been lifted, the fact that the US still maintains a long list of them against Iran goes to show just how much Iran can't be affected directly through conventional warfare. And while Iran has many neighbors that are hostile to it, the third entry on our list has no neighbors at all. We're talking about Australia. Geographically, Australia is perhaps best described as a floating wasteland. If you venture just a few dozen miles away from the coast, this massive landmass is practically uninhabited. The nation is almost 3 million square miles of desert. Australia's major population centres are protected by not only the scorching heat of the island's internal territory, but also by the Great Barrier Reef, making naval attacks from the northeast unlikely. Considering that that's where the Pacific lies, Australia is protected against most naval powers that use the ocean, including China, Japan, and the US. The prospect of conquering Australia via land would mean that the invading army would have to traverse thousands of miles of practically barren landscapes. The sheer distances involved would allow the defending army to hide pretty much anywhere and conduct precision strikes using highly effective guerrilla warfare tactics. Militarily, Australia maintains a standing army of roughly 50,000 troops, with a negligible number of land vehicles compared to most other powers. The country does own a few helicopter carriers and destroyers, allowing it to repel attacks from incoming navies. This further cements the idea that it would be unlikely that Australia would need to fight a ground-based attack. During World War II, Japan briefly considered attacking Australia, but gave up on the prospect since the country was so far away from Japan that it made refueling and restocking a burdensome prospect. Instead, the country opted for small-scale air attacks to isolate the country from its allies and prevent its land forces from being deployed abroad. In modern times, Australia is actually in a geopolitical alliance with Japan through the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, or the Quad for short. The other members of the Quad are India and the US, meaning that the country is in geopolitically good relations with countries that practically control the Indian and Pacific Oceans through their combined naval power. Australia's nearest neighbours are likewise island nations and are similarly under-equipped to conduct any kind of surprise invasion on the country. From a country that's close to no one but allied with many, we go to a country chock full of neighbours that maintains a neutral stance. The next entry on our list is Switzerland. Famous for being neutral in practically every major military conflict, modern Switzerland is surrounded by NATO countries. As such, a land invasion from anyone other than members of NATO is practically unthinkable. Considering that the country's major strength in world geopolitics is its pervasive economy and banking, on which many NATO countries rely, even that will be an unlikely prospect. Despite being neutral, the country does have a plan of defense in case it comes under attack. The strategy relies on using Switzerland's primarily mountainous terrain to its utmost advantage. The Swiss built military bases and forts in vital choke points throughout the mountain passes. During World War II, the plan was expanded to wire all major roads and railroads with dynamite. An enemy invading the country would basically be forced to use unpaved mountain tracks for most of its inward journey, while the Swiss would use the tunnels and fortifications along the way to strike at approaching armies in true guerrilla warfare fashion. However, just because the country is neutral doesn't mean it's unprepared. Switzerland maintained a large active military of 600,000 men all the way until 1995. In more recent years, that number has been reduced to 100,000, still ranking it in the top third of countries by military size. The country is also one of the few to maintain mandatory conscription for all men, with recruits typically entering service at the age of 20. Women are also allowed to volunteer for military service. The country's strong democracy also supports the idea of maintaining a sizable military. The most recent proposal to abolish the mandatory military service in 2013 failed, with only 27% votes in support. Adding to this the fact that the people who finish military service in Switzerland can keep their weapons. As a result, the country has one of the highest rates of gun ownership, with over a quarter of civilians owning weapons according to 2017 registries. However, it's likely that the actual gun ownership rate is much higher, with some reports suggesting as many as 45 guns per 100 people. As such, if Switzerland actually gets invaded, a large portion of its population can be drafted into the military relatively quickly, and an even larger one will defend themselves. From a country that's small but armed, we go to the largest country in the world, and one that's also armed to the teeth: Russia. Russia is widely considered among the top 10 military powers in the world. However, its greatest strength when repelling an invasion is likely its favorable geographical position. Most of the country is covered in tundra, which is sparsely populated and prone to temperatures far below freezing. This makes an invading army just as likely to die from the cold as from bullets. But even the country's western parts, those in the Eurasian steppe, aren't much better off for an invading army. This was proven multiple times over the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries, when Russia repelled an invasion from the Swedish, the French, and the Germans respectively. Every time, the harsh Russian winters put any plans of invading to reach the country's population centers on hold. Adding to this the fact that the country is actually the largest in the world. At 6.3 million square miles of land, a Russian enemy that wants to fully subjugate the country would need to invest significant manpower to ensure there are no pockets of resistance hiding in any of the numerous corners of the Russian wilderness. Russia's military could be considered one of the direct competitors to that of the US and China. While the country's progress stagnated after the fall of the Soviet Union, the nation still boasts one of the largest militaries in the world by active military personnel. By some counts, the country has between 500,000 and 1.3 million active troops, yearly replenished by compulsory military service. Furthermore, while conscripts aren't allowed to be deployed abroad, there are no such stipulations against using Russia's large population for national defense. The main strength of Russia's military lies in its numbers. The country has the world's largest arsenal of tanks, towed artillery, and self-propelled artillery. While most of these vehicles are starting to become obsolete, some improvements, particularly in the artillery sphere, are still on par or above their Western counterparts. But Russia has one more trick up its sleeve to deter an invasion. The country has the most nuclear weapons in the world, approximately the same as the US, but spread across a much larger area to deter a simultaneous attack on nuclear silos. With an estimated 1,700 nuclear warheads primed to be launched at a moment's notice, Russia can respond to a large-scale invasion in less than half an hour. The next country on our list shares some geographical similarities to Russia, but makes use of geopolitics for most of its defense: Canada. The second largest country by land area, Canada also has plenty of barren landscapes that would need to be controlled to count as occupied. Even more importantly, the country has only one neighbor, the United States, with the rest of its borders lying along the oceans. A bulk of its population is also located alongside the Great Lakes, straight along the country's border with the US. As such, an invading army that doesn't want to go through the US itself would likely need to mount a naval offensive through Hudson Bay and then trek across the tundra to reach the Great Lakes. Considering how deep into Canada the Hudson Bay actually is, this means that the Canadian, or more likely Allied, Navy could surround the attackers and stall the invasion. But what about the United States? Shouldn't it be a major concern for Canada's national defense, considering that most of the country's population is close to the US border? Well, both countries have been part of the NATO alliance for decades. This means that it's incredibly unlikely that Canada will get invaded by the US anytime soon. Even though its biggest ally is also its only neighbor, Canada would likely do well by itself in the event of an invasion. The country maintains a standing army of 70,000 people. And while the country's military is not in its best shape, considering decades-long alliances precluding the need for an organized army, Canadian troops frequently train alongside American ones to ensure they're ready for conflicts both on the continent and abroad. The next country on our list might be surprising: North Korea. Yes, the country that is practically geopolitically isolated from most of the world. North Korea is backed by two powerful countries to its north, China and Russia. This was particularly notable during the Korean War. 2 years after a back-and-forth war of attrition on the border, South Korea, the US, and their allies were unable to capture North Korea. It should be noted that North Korea is considered technologically far behind modern superpowers, most notably the US, Japan, the EU, China, and even Russia. However, what the country lacks in terms of progress, it makes up for in numbers. The mandatory military service that lasts 8 years for all men and 5 years for all women means that the country maintains a larger supply of active personnel than its population of 26 million would imply. By most recent estimates, the country has an active military manpower of 1.3 million, making it the third or fourth largest military in the world. In fact, if a war breaks out, it's estimated that North Korea will be able to draft roughly a third of its total population. North Korea has been using Chinese and Russian military technology and trying to improve on it. However, what it's perhaps most known for is its numerous ballistic missile tests, roughly half of which end in utter failure. But it's only a matter of time until that metric improves, which might put the US, South Korea, and the rest of NATO on high alert and trigger a renewed conflict on the Korean peninsula. If that happens, China and Russia would more than likely once again come to North Korea's aid, which would essentially cause a large-scale war that could lead to the deaths of millions. Considering that China and the US are currently in a staring contest over Taiwan, a war over North Korea is unlikely to be in either side's best interests. Thus, the future of North Korea remains uncertain. Next up is a country that has proven itself to be more resilient than its opponents would like: Israel. As a country, Israel is basically surrounded by its enemies. All of its neighbors are Arab countries and are part of the greater Arab-Israeli conflict that's only gotten worse in recent years. To counter seemingly endless threats, particularly from Iran, which supplies most of Israel's opponents with weaponry, Israel has built up its economy and military alike. The country is currently ranked among the top 20 military powers in the world, based on two key metrics. First, Israel maintains a near-universal requirement of mandatory military service, with 3 years for men and 2 for women. This has led to a standing army of 176,000 and a possible reserve force of over 465,000 in the case of open warfare. Secondly, the country has access to US-level technology, especially when it comes to anti-air defenses, long-range warfare, and drone operations. The country also fields modern tanks and fighter jets. Additionally, Israel is one of the few countries that has access to nuclear weaponry. Although the Israeli nuclear arsenal is not on the level of the US and Russia, its ballistic missile Jericho-3, which is purported to be a part of the Israeli nuclear missile program, has a range comparable to long-range missiles that the former two countries use. Arguably, Israel isn't particularly difficult to invade, considering that the country has been receiving foreign aid from the US for years. In fact, Israel has received more aid from the US than any other non-NATO countries so far. Without that lifeline, it would likely have a much harder time surviving, surrounded by Arab countries that want to remove it from existence. But with the US and the rest of NATO being staunchly pro-Israel, it's unlikely that this situation will stop. Thus, the conflict surrounding Israel will likely continue, and with Israel being technologically superior to pretty much all of its neighbors, any invasion of Israel will likely prove deadly and might even cause the US to provide direct military assistance. Thus, we're down to our top two countries that can't be conquered. In the second place, we have a tie between Japan and the UK. Both countries share many similarities that they've utilized to their advantage. Historically, both Japan and the United Kingdom were powerful empires with navies to help them project power far beyond their national borders. The last time the UK was completely conquered was in the 11th century during the Norman Conquest. In fact, the current British King, Charles III, can trace his lineage to the leader of England at the time, William the Conqueror. Japan, on the other hand, was only occupied after World War II, after the US dropped not one, but two atomic bombs on Japanese cities, practically forcing a capitulation. Geographically, both countries are islands with few, if any, direct ties to other nations. The UK is slightly more connected via its land border with Ireland and a tunnel to France. Japan is both mountainous and seismically active, one of the few places with abundant earthquakes and volcanic eruptions. The latter has led to Japan adopting specific infrastructure, which is highly resistant to natural disasters, making its buildings particularly sturdy.